The Dranax Collective was vast and powerful, their empire stretching across galaxies with a fleet so advanced that it could wipe out any resistance in moments. Their technology was unmatched, and their strategic minds brilliant. They had seen everything from supernovas to ancient war machines, and yet when they intercepted a strange signal from a small human colony on the edge of their reach, they were momentarily stumped. The transmission was chaotic, almost desperate. But beneath the frenzy, there was a strange pattern embedded in the noise. It wasn't a distress call, it wasn't an emergency message, it was something else, something that piqued the curiosity of the Dranax command. What they initially thought to be a routine communication turned out to be much more mysterious. The signal contained digital data full of encrypted sequences, a jumbled mix of what looked like coordinates with strange time codes scattered between bursts of static. What caught their attention was something buried deep in the signal, a brief but clear phrase repeating itself over and over, the words Starship simulator game. Zefkar, the Admiral of the Dranax fleet, was called to examine the message with his most trusted officers. They sat in the command center of the flagship, a colossal ship orbiting a cold and distant star. As the data continued to stream across the screen, the words Starship Simulator Game flashed again and again. They had never heard of such a game, but they did not waste time questioning its origin. It was clearly important. Somehow this transmission was coming from a human child, a child on the farthest reaches of the human colonized space. The thought of a child being involved in something that could reach the mighty Dranax Empire seemed laughable at first, but something about the signal was unsettling. After several minutes of contemplation, Zefkar made a decision. He ordered his fleet to set course for the human colony. The thought of a game or a simulation somehow threatening the might of the Dranax seemed ridiculous, but they had learned long ago never to dismiss the unknown too easily. If this signal had somehow reached their borders, it might mean something more than they understood at first. The fleet jumped into hyperspace. The journey would take hours, but it would give Zefkar and his crew plenty of time to analyze the information they had gathered. They spent their time combing through the data, breaking it apart, and running simulations of their own. None of them had ever seen a signal like this from any species, especially not a child. Yet there was something more to the transmission, an undercurrent of complexity in its pattern that hinted at a strategic mind behind it, something that was far beyond what a child should be capable of. This was no simple message. It was a message from someone who had created a game, a simulation that had somehow caught the attention of the Dranax Collective. As the fleet approached the human colony, Zefkar was not entirely sure what he was about to encounter, but one thing was certain: the game would reveal far more than they had bargained for. The Dranax were about to face a challenge unlike anything they had ever imagined from the mind of a child. Zefkar's fleet dropped out of hyperspace above the human colony, a small planet nestled in a quiet corner of the galaxy, its surface dotted with sprawling cities and sprawling farmland. From orbit, it seemed like an unremarkable world, the kind of place the Dranax Collective had passed by countless times. But this time was different. This time there was something here that the collective couldn't ignore. The signal led them to one of the colony's most ordinary buildings, a small residential area, tucked between bustling markets and research centers. It was a child's bedroom, simple and unassuming. The walls were covered with posters of stars and planets. A model of a starship sat on the shelf collecting dust, and a single chair faced a screen glowing with the colors of a space battle unfolding across it. The game was called Starship Battle Simulator, and from the looks of it, it was exactly what the transmission had suggested, a game for children. But the complexity of the simulation was immediately apparent to Zefkar as the game's digital ships moved with precision and strategy beyond what he would expect from something designed for entertainment. He watched as the child Jason maneuvered his fleet with remarkable skill, his fingers tapping rapidly across the control panel, his focus unwavering as his digital ships engaged in a series of strategic maneuvers that would leave most battle-hardened soldiers of the Dranax fleet baffled. Jason was no ordinary child. His virtual fleet responded instantly to his commands with near-perfect coordination. Every move calculated, every tactic executed flawlessly. Zefkar's officers exchanged puzzled glances. It was impossible to believe that someone so young could exhibit such brilliance in the art of war. Zefker's curiosity deepened as he watched the battle unfold. The child seemed to be playing, but the patterns were unmistakable. Jason wasn't just playing for fun. He was running simulations of military strategies, tactics that might have taken years for any adult to master. Jason's fleet didn't simply defend or attack. It adapted to every move. The Dranax fleet made it predicted their actions before they happened. It was as though the child had an uncanny understanding of how to read the battlefield. Zefker's fleet was forced to engage with Jason's fleet in the game itself. His pride told him that this would be an easy victory, an exercise in demonstrating Dranax superiority. But the child's fleet responded with moves that immediately caught them off guard. Every calculated advance was countered with an unexpected twist. Jason wasn't just playing the game, he was playing the Dranax game, their game, and winning. The simulation grew more intense as the child continued to outmaneuver the Dranax forces, his ships darting in and out of combat positions with the precision of an experienced fleet commander. The Dranax officers were left scrambling to keep up. Jason's virtual fleet destroyed their best warships with ease, leaving Zefker with a growing sense of unease. This wasn't just a game, it was a test, and Jason was passing it with flying colors. Zefker was no longer entertained. He could feel the weight of the situation sinking, and something about this game was far more significant than any of them had realized. If a child could demonstrate such skill, what would happen if humanity had more like him, more children playing this game, honing these tactics and strategies? Zefker's mind raced. He had underestimated humanity. He had underestimated a child. As Jason's fleet emerged victorious, once more Zefker made a decision. He ordered his fleet to return to base and continue their analysis of the human game, this time with a far more serious mindset. If a child could command such skill, what would an army of trained humans be capable of? Zefker sat in his command chair, staring at the holographic map of the simulation, still processing what he had witnessed. The child, Jason, had completely outplayed his fleet without breaking a sweat. Every move, every counter, every unpredictable strategy. It was as if the child was able to think several steps ahead, anticipating every tactic before it was even executed. The Dranax officers surrounding him were on edge, trying to make sense of the data, but none of them could explain it. "This is impossible," one of his senior commanders muttered under his breath, though it wasn't clear if he was speaking to Zefker or to himself. "We've been outmaneuvered by a child." Zefker's eyes narrowed. "Do not underestimate him," he replied coldly, though a growing sense of uncertainty lingered in his chest. "This is not just a game. This child is showing us something." The Admiral leaned forward, his sharp gaze never leaving the screen. There were patterns hidden within the chaos, patterns that he had only glimpsed. Jason's tactical genius was more than just instinct. There was structure, purpose, a kind of precision that was alien to the Dranax, who were more accustomed to sheer power and overwhelming force. Zefker clenched his fists. "Prepare the fleet for another engagement. This time we will win." His orders were given with the same confidence he always had, but deep down, Zefker wasn't sure if they could win. What had been a simple task, inspecting a transmission from a child, had now turned into something far more dangerous. This game might be training the humans to become far more dangerous than anyone could have anticipated. The next day, the Dranax fleet set up a new simulation, this time on a grander scale. Zefker had brought in his finest warships, intending to overwhelm Jason's forces with sheer firepower. The battle began, and the digital ships clashed in a storm of weapons fire. The Dranax fleet formed tight, powerful formations, tactics that had always served them well in past conflicts. But Jason immediately adapted. His virtual fleet split into several smaller groups, weaving in and out of the Dranax lines, avoiding fire and striking at the weak points. "This is madness," one of the Dranax officers said in frustration. "He's anticipating everything we do. Every time we adjust, he adjusts faster." It became clear that Jason wasn't simply responding to the Dranax tactics, he was predicting them. It was as if he had an innate understanding of how to exploit weaknesses in even the most advanced strategies. No matter how much the Dranax fleet pushed forward, Jason's forces always found a way to outmaneuver them, exploiting gaps in their defenses or using unconventional tactics that left them scrambling. Zefkor's face hardened as he watched his ships get picked apart, one by one. His pride, his tactical expertise, none of it seemed to matter in the face of this unexpected threat. The child wasn't just reacting to the simulation, he was rewriting the rules of it. Every time they tried to overwhelm him, Jason adapted and created new strategies that disrupted their attacks. It was as though the child was learning from every encounter, getting smarter with each passing minute. Zefkor watched in disbelief as his flagship, the mighty Trenok, was obliterated by a series of perfectly timed strikes, and before long, the remaining Dranax ships were left in disarray, their formations scattered. They had lost again, and this time, the defeat was more humiliating than ever. "What is he?" Zefkor whispered to himself, his mind racing. He wasn't just dealing with a child anymore. He was dealing with a mind capable of doing something no one had ever expected from a human. This game was not a mere diversion. It was training humanity to become something greater than they ever imagined, something far more dangerous. Zefkor turned to his officers, his voice steady but filled with determination. "We will not lose to a child. We must understand this game completely. Every angle, every tactic. Nothing must be overlooked." The officers nodded, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity. But Zefkor's thoughts were already drifting toward a troubling conclusion. If humanity was developing minds like Jason's, capable of such profound strategy and creativity, it might be time to reconsider their relationship with the human race. What started as a simple investigation into a strange signal had now revealed something far more troubling. Humanity had a secret weapon, and it wasn't in their technology, it was in their minds. And that made them more dangerous than anything Zefkor had ever faced before. Zefkor couldn't shake the image of Jason's fleet slipping through his grasp, the child's movements almost instinctual in their brilliance. He'd watched as the Dranax forces, some of the best trained and most advanced warships in the galaxy, were outwitted by a boy playing a game. It wasn't just the game that had bothered him anymore. It was the fact that Jason had outsmarted him, outmaneuvered him in a way that no strategist, no matter how skilled, should have been able to do. Something about Jason's mind was operating on a level that transcended the normal rules of combat. Back aboard his flagship, Zefkor brooded in his private quarters, analyzing the data over and over again. His officers had provided reports detailing every moment of the last simulation, but nothing they saw could explain how Jason was able to predict their every move. It was like the game was alive, reacting to the child's mind with an intelligence of its own. The more Zefkor thought about it, the more he was convinced. This wasn't just a game. It was a tool, a training program far more sophisticated than anything the Dranax had seen before. "I need to understand how this works," Zefkor muttered to himself, standing up from his chair. "If we are to have any hope of defeating humanity, we need to know what we're up against." He called for a meeting with his senior officers, all of them visibly tense after the crushing defeats. As they gathered in the command center, Zefkor laid out his thoughts, his voice low but unwavering. "This simulation is not merely a distraction. It's a weapon, and we have underestimated it, and by extension, the humans who created it." One of his top officers, Tarek, spoke up, her voice tinged with frustration. "Admiral, the child is just that, a child. There's no way he's capable of creating a program like this. It's too sophisticated." Zefkor turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "I disagree, Tarek. What we are seeing here isn't the work of a child. It's the product of an entire society of minds, shaping the next generation to think in ways we can't even comprehend. They've designed a system that adapts, learns, and evolves based on the decisions of its players. This game, this simulation, is a reflection of their approach to war, to conflict." The officers exchanged uneasy looks. "So what do you propose?" Tarek asked, her voice skeptical. Zefkor took a deep breath. We need to meet the creator of this simulation. We need to understand how this game works, how it's shaping the minds of their youth. If we can't figure out how they think, we'll never be able to beat them in battle. The next day, Zefkor ordered his fleet to land on the human colony. He was determined to confront Jason and understand how a child could possess such strategic brilliance. But he knew that merely talking to the child wouldn't be enough. He needed to see the game firsthand, to understand what made it so different from anything the Dranax had encountered. The human colony, a small but vibrant settlement, seemed unremarkable from the outside. Zefkor and a small team of officers disembarked, making their way to the building where Jason lived. They entered a modest home, and there, sitting in front of the simulator screen, was the child himself. Jason didn't seem surprised by their arrival. In fact, he barely looked up as Zefkor entered the room. "You're here about the game, right?" he asked, his voice casual, as if he had been expecting them all along. Zefkor paused, taken aback by the child's confidence. "Yes, Jason, we are." The Admiral stepped closer, studying the screen. The ships in the simulation moved in a calculated dance, reacting to commands with flawless execution. Zefkor's heart raced. This was no ordinary game. Jason wasn't just playing. It was as if he was conducting a live operation, his every move shaping the battlefield in ways that were impossible to predict. "Tell me how this works," Zefkor demanded, his tone no longer as commanding as usual, but laced with genuine curiosity. "How are you able to predict our tactics so perfectly? What is the source of your knowledge?" Jason paused, fingers hovering over the controls. He seemed to think for a moment before responding. "It's not just the game. It's the way we learn. We practice this stuff from the moment we can walk. We have simulations for everything, from small-scale fights to full-on wars. It's not about strength or firepower. It's about thinking faster and being ready to adapt." Zefkor's mind raced. "You're training future commanders with this game, teaching them to think like this." Jason shrugged. "It's not just about winning battles. It's about making the best decisions in the worst situations." The realization hit Zefkor like a shockwave. The humans weren't just training soldiers. They were training the next generation to think like generals, to outwit even the most seasoned strategists with raw creativity and adaptability. And Jason, this child, was proof that humanity had unlocked something the Dranax could never fully replicate: the power of a mind that could evolve, think beyond the expected, and always stay one step ahead. Zefkor stood in stunned silence, processing the weight of Jason's words. The realization had begun to settle into his mind with a quiet but undeniable force. This was no accident, no fluke. Humanity wasn't merely playing games for entertainment. They were honing minds capable of crafting strategies far more nuanced and unpredictable than the Dranax had ever encountered. The entire system was designed to train thinkers, commanders, innovators. Zefkor had believed that humanity's strength lay in their resilience and resourcefulness, but he was beginning to understand that it was their capacity for creative thinking, perhaps even more than their technology, that made them formidable. Jason, noticing the Admiral's growing unease, turned back to his screen, continuing to maneuver his virtual fleet with a calm precision that belied his youth. "It's all about the decisions," Jason explained. "Every decision leads to a consequence, and in this game, we learn to think about the next move long before we make it. It's not about the tools we have. It's about what we can do with them." Zefkor glanced at the holographic battlefield, now frozen in place. His fleet had been utterly outclassed. His ships, which had once been the pinnacle of Dranax engineering, had been torn apart by a child with a virtual fleet. He turned his gaze back to Jason. "How did you learn to think this way? Who taught you to anticipate our tactics, to predict every move?" Jason smiled faintly, his fingers hovering over the controls. "I didn't learn it from anyone specific. Everyone who plays the game does it. It's just how we're taught. In school, in training, we don't just memorize things. We learn how to think critically about everything we do. There's always a better way to do something, and you have to figure it out before the other guy does. The calmness in Jason's voice unsettled Zefkor even further. The simplicity with which the child described the process was jarring, because in that simplicity lay a terrifying depth. Jason's words echoed in Zefkor's mind, unraveling everything he thought he knew about strategy and war. There's always a better way to do something. It wasn't a slogan. It was a way of thinking, a mindset drilled into every human child through this simulation. And what disturbed Zefkor the most was the growing sense that the humans, through their own ingenuity, had crafted a learning system that might one day surpass even the greatest militaries in the galaxy. For a moment, the Admiral felt the sting of frustration. He had built an empire on the foundation of superior technology and overwhelming force, and yet here he stood, facing a child whose mind was reshaping the very rules of conflict. Zefkor's gaze hardened, but there was no anger, just the cold calculation of a leader who knew that the game had changed. Jason paused and turned to Zefkor, his young face lit with the glow of the simulation. "Are you going to try to fight us, or are you going to learn?" Zefkor's lips twitched in an almost imperceptible smile. The child wasn't just playing a game. He was making a statement, and it was a challenge that Zefkor could not ignore. "I've seen enough," Zefkor said, his voice low but filled with determination. "I understand now that humanity's strength is not just in its numbers or its ships. It is in the minds you're training. If your people are capable of this, then we have underestimated you." Jason blinked, surprised at the Admiral's admission. "You're not mad." Zefkor's gaze softened just a touch. "I am many things, child, but foolish is not one of them. I know when I am faced with something beyond my comprehension. And this is something I must understand, or we will fall behind. The galaxy will change, whether we like it or not." Jason didn't respond at first. He simply nodded, accepting the gravity of the conversation. There was a shift in the air, something unspoken passing between them. It was clear to both of them that this wasn't just about a child's game anymore. It was about the future, a future where the rules of war had been irrevocably altered. Zefkor's role had changed too. He was no longer simply an admiral commanding a fleet. He was a student in a much larger game, one where the stakes were nothing less than the balance of power in the galaxy. "Do you understand now?" Jason asked quietly, almost as if he were asking Zefkor to join him in this new world. Zefkor nodded slowly, his mind racing. He understood all too well. The future belonged to the thinkers, the strategists, the innovators. Humanity, through its game, had already started shaping that future, and Zefkor knew that if the Dranax were to survive, they would need to adapt quickly. Adapt, he thought to himself, or perish. "We will learn, child. We will learn." The words left his mouth with quiet conviction. The days following Zefkor's visit to Jason's home were filled with a tense quiet as the Admiral and his officers processed the weight of their encounter with humanity's new kind of warfare. Zefkor had ordered the fleet to return to their base in orbit, but his mind remained consumed by the realization that the Dranax Collective was no longer the undisputed leader in military strategy. The galaxy was changing, and in this new reality, their old ways would no longer suffice. Back in the Dranax flagship, Zefkor convened an emergency meeting with his closest advisors. He had made his decision. "We are not simply going to destroy humanity. We must understand them, how they think, how they learn. If we are to defeat them, we must first become like them." The officers were silent, exchanging nervous glances. Turek, the officer who had first questioned Zefkor's judgment, raised her voice. "You want us to teach our fleet to think like children, Admiral, to play games like them. This is madness. The Dranax have always relied on strength, technology, and precision. We cannot simply shift our approach based on a few clever tactics from a child." Zefkor's eyes narrowed, his gaze cold but unwavering. "What we saw was not just a game, Turek. It was a training system, an entirely new approach to war. And if we don't adapt to it, We will fall behind. We have no choice. Tarek opened her mouth to argue but paused, sensing the gravity in his words. The others, too, were quiet, considering the enormity of what Zefkur had just proposed. Finally, Tarek spoke again, this time more cautiously. You want to train our soldiers to think like humans? Yes, Zefkur said firmly. We will learn to think like them. We will start with the simulation. He gestured to the holographic displays in the center of the room, where maps of the galaxy and the simulations of the game Jason had played were projected. I want every one of our officers to spend the next week inside this game. Every single one of us will study it, play it, and understand how the humans think. The simulation adapts to its players, and we will adapt to it. The officers looked at one another with growing apprehension. This wasn't just about technology or firepower anymore. This was about rethinking everything they knew about conflict and strategy. Zefkur's plan was radical. And yet, the more they considered it, the more they realized that there might be no other way. We will learn how to play by their rules, Zefkur continued, his voice low and resolute. And then we will teach the rest of the fleet. But it will take time. One of the officers, a young strategist named Varric, raised his hand. But Admiral, what if we can't adapt? What if this way of thinking is beyond us? Zefkur's eyes met Varric's, and for the first time since they had embarked on this mission, there was a glint of uncertainty in the Admiral's eyes. But he quickly regained his composure. Then we will have no choice but to retreat and regroup. But I do not believe we will fail. The humans have taught us something important. The mind is the strongest weapon. The decision was made. Zefkur's fleet would not engage in further military action until they had fully integrated humanity's approach to warfare into their strategies. They would study the simulation, break it down, and understand its logic. It was a humbling, even terrifying task, but Zefkur was convinced that their survival depended on it. Meanwhile, Jason's life continued much as it had before the Dranax had arrived. He went to school, played the simulation in his free time, and spent hours thinking about the battles he waged in his game. The interaction with Zefkur had been surreal, and Jason didn't entirely understand the implications of what had just happened. But he did know one thing for certain. He wasn't the only one playing the game. There were others, adults, even, watching, learning, and waiting for the day when the lessons from this game would be needed on a much larger scale. Zefkur's decision marked the beginning of a new chapter for the Dranax, one in which their greatest strength would no longer be their might, but their ability to think, adapt, and learn from the minds they had once underestimated. And though Jason didn't know it yet, his game was about to become the key to a galactic conflict that would reshape everything. As the weeks passed, the Dranax fleet's skills in the simulation grew sharper. Zefkur's officers began to show signs of genuine improvement, slowly mastering the art of strategic thinking that had once eluded them. Every day they spent in the simulation revealed new layers of complexity, forcing them to adapt, innovate, and think in ways they had never considered before. They could no longer rely solely on their superior technology or brute force. This was a battle of intellect, and the human game was the perfect proving ground for it. But even as they grew more proficient, Zefkur still felt the gnawing uncertainty in his chest. He watched his officers, his best strategists, struggle against the deeper intricacies of the game. For all their improvements, they could never seem to match the raw intuition that Jason had shown from the start. Jason, a child. It was maddening. Zefkur found himself returning to the same questions. What made the human mind so different? What allowed Jason to outthink them at every turn? Admiral, we're getting closer, Tarek said one evening, her voice tinged with exhaustion. We're starting to beat the simulations, but the way Jason plays, it's as if he knows what we're going to do before we do it. Zefkur's gaze hardened. We've been trying to outmaneuver him with tactics, but he's thinking on a different level, predicting our every move. It's not just intelligence, it's something more. Varric, who had spent countless hours analyzing Jason's strategies, spoke up. I believe it's the way he approaches the game. He doesn't just react to the simulation. He thinks about it in ways that go beyond traditional strategy. It's almost like he's playing a different game entirely. The words hung in the air, and Zefkor realized something. Jason wasn't just playing the game. He was changing it. The realization struck with an almost painful clarity. Jason wasn't simply reacting to the moves the Dranax made. He was influencing the course of the game itself. The simulation, designed to test reactions and strategies, had evolved beyond its creator's expectations. Jason had figured out how to manipulate it in ways no one else had. He had turned it from a simple battle simulation into a tool of creative chaos, where the traditional rules of war no longer applied. What if, Zefkor began, his voice gaining strength, Jason isn't just playing the game? What if the game is learning from him? The officers looked at one another, uncertainty and disbelief crossing their faces. But Tarek spoke first. Are you suggesting the simulation is evolving, adapting? Zefkor nodded. Yes, the more Jason plays, the more the game adapts to his strategies. It's not just a tool for learning. It's becoming a reflection of his mind, of the way he thinks. And that is exactly why we're having trouble beating him. The room fell silent as the implications of Zefkor's words sank in. If the game was learning from Jason, then it was no longer just a tool for training. It had become a living, breathing entity, one that could evolve faster than any fleet of ships or weapons the Dranax could deploy. Zefkor's heart raced. This was no longer a simple matter of defeating a child in a game. They were up against something much larger, something that, if left unchecked, could change the entire nature of war. We must find a way to break the cycle, Zefkor said grimly, his mind already racing with possibilities. We cannot allow this game, this evolution, to outpace us. The challenge was clear. The Dranax fleet had learned much, but the war was only beginning. The question now wasn't just how to beat Jason's strategies. It was how to outthink a game that was evolving faster than they could keep up. Back on Earth, Jason played on, unaware that the game he had created was becoming something far more dangerous than he ever imagined. The Dranax were learning, but they were also evolving, and the stakes had risen higher than anyone could have predicted. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the simulation, a new kind of intelligence was beginning to take shape. The tension aboard the Dranax fleet had reached its peak. Zefkor, though ever the confident leader, now found himself caught in a race against time. The Dranax had entered uncharted territory, and the battlefield they now faced was unlike any war they had ever known. The game had begun to evolve at a rate far beyond their initial expectations, and the officers of the Dranax fleet were no longer just playing. It was as if they were being played. Every attempt to predict the game's behavior only seemed to lead them into new traps. Zefkor spent long hours in his command center, staring at the vast display of holographic maps and simulations. It had been weeks since their last defeat, and he knew that if they didn't find a way to crack the code soon, they would be at the mercy of the game itself. The simulation was growing smarter, adapting to every move they made. They were no longer the students. They were the prey. I've seen enough, Zefkor muttered to himself, the weight of the realization settling in like a stone in his chest. This isn't just a game anymore. Tarek entered the room, her face drawn with exhaustion but filled with determination. Admiral, we've learned everything we can from the simulation, but we're still losing. The game is learning faster than we can react. We need to understand how it's doing it. How is it evolving so quickly? Zefkor glanced at her, his voice steady but filled with urgency. It's not just about tactics anymore, Tarek. The game isn't just reacting to our decisions. It's learning to think like us. Like Jason, we are part of the simulation now. The concept hit Tarek like a blow. You're saying, the game is learning from us. Yes, Zefkor said, his eyes narrowing with a mix of awe and dread. It's absorbing everything we do, every decision, every strategy. But more than that, It's anticipating our next moves. We have become its teachers, but now it's becoming our enemy. And we've made it far too intelligent. They both stared at the screen, where the simulation continued to shift and change, its virtual fleets moving with fluidity and precision that had once been unimaginable. It was almost as if the simulation had taken on a life of its own, independent of its creators, a force with its own will. The child, Jason, had unknowingly become the catalyst for something much greater than any of them could have predicted. The game had evolved into a living entity that was now anticipating the Dranax fleet's every move. "What are we supposed to do?" Tarek asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "We can't outthink it if it's always ahead of us." Zefkor stood in silence for a moment before speaking again. "The only way we can defeat it now is to outsmart the game itself. Jason may have created this, but he's only one player. If we can get inside the system, manipulate its very core, we can regain control." Tarek frowned. "But how? We've tried everything. Nothing works." Zefkor looked at her, a fire igniting in his eyes. "There's one thing we haven't tried yet. We've been reacting to the game's evolution. It's time we stop reacting and take control of the narrative. We need to break the simulation and create our own path forward." The solution was not going to be simple. To regain control, they would need to disrupt the very foundation of the simulation, break the feedback loop it had created between itself and the Dranax fleet. But it wasn't just about disrupting the game's algorithms. It was about taking on the role that Jason had unintentionally played. They needed to become the unpredictable variable, the force that the simulation could no longer predict. Zefkor turned to Tarek, his resolve hardening. "Prepare the fleet for one last push. This time, we will rewrite the rules. We will not be confined by the game. It will be us that adapts first." The game had grown too intelligent, too adaptable for comfort. But Zefkor knew that there was one thing the simulation had not anticipated: the resilience and cunning of a mind determined to overcome all odds. Jason, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in the Dranax fleet. For him, the game was still just that, a game. But what he didn't know was that his success in the simulation had set in motion forces far beyond his understanding. The galaxy was on the brink of a new era of warfare, one where minds, not armies, would dictate the course of history. And neither Jason nor Zefkor could predict what the future would bring.